where did it come from, and does it matter where it came from? It matters a lot. If, in fact, COVID-19 came from the Wuhan lab, where there was a mismanagement by the laboratory, that's a completely different scenario if it came from bats that infected humans at a wet market. The Chinese government needs to help the world understand this. And what early on had been seen as a conspiracy theory that this was a leak from the lab is now being seen as a more mainstream possibility. The one thing I've learned about this lab, they spent a lot of time and money in making sure everything is clean and done right, and they control the whole system to avoid a breach. So there is a Wall Street Journal editorial by two specialists in this area saying that based on an analysis of the COVID-19 virus, the most likely scenario is it came from a lab, not from nature. That is important. So I'm going to ask Dr. Fauci about the work product of these two gentlemen and ask him, do you agree with their analysis that due to the sequencing, it seems to be more a virus that came from a man-made manipulation in a lab versus from a bat to a wet market? I don't know what Dr. Fauci is going to say, but there's a fairly compelling case, and I'm by no means a scientist, but the logic in this article is pretty compelling. What will I be doing? I will be partnering up with my colleagues in the House and the Senate to introduce sanctions against China for the following purpose. If China doesn't help the international community and cooperate with the international community about where the virus came from, we will sanction them until they do. I don't trust China. I don't trust them to be honest with the world. It would be very embarrassing and devastating to China if this came out of a lab, not from nature. So the only way you're going to get China to cooperate, I believe, is to put pressure on them. So number one, I want Dr. Fauci to look at the article here and see if he agrees that the most logical source of the virus came from a lab in China, not a bat in China. That would make a big difference to me. Most likely what happened is that they had captured this virus years ago from a bat in China, and they were doing gain-of-function research trying to sort of increase its potency to be able to deal with treatment. Well, most likely it seems, I don't know for sure, that that research got leaked, that the source of the virus was not a wet market in Wuhan but came from this particular lab. If that's true, that's devastating because it shows the lab is not sound and it's a completely different source than a wet market in China. And we're going to have to get to the bottom of this because this could happen again. So the variant that we're seeing developing in the country right now, as the virus replicates itself and comes up in a different form, the testing will be done primarily here in South Carolina. This is the first company really in the country that I know of that's invested heavily in being able to test variants. I don't want to scare people, but the likelihood of this thing replicating itself and penetrating the vaccine is real. That's why you need to follow that so you can change your vaccines in the future to make sure we don't have another massive outbreak. So with that, I'll take a few questions.
A couple. The WHO went to investigate. What will you do? Because when they went, it was almost like a tour, is what I'm hearing reports.
Yeah.
So what can you do in order to make China comply to allow our researchers to see the origin or get their hands on the original evidence?
Well, there's two things I want to do. I want to deal with the Chinese refusal to cooperate. The WHO was shown what China wanted them to see. They didn't have the ability to go in there and interview people and investigate whether or not it came from the lab. It was a dog and pony show. That's unacceptable. But first, I want to know, how did our government potentially get it so wrong? There was a group of scientists early on who wrote a letter saying that the idea of a lab leak was conspiratorial, right-wing talking points. How did they know? Is there a deep state science department? Is the NIH and the State Department, were there people in those two organizations trying to tamp down the idea that it may have come from the lab? Because they support the lab. It seems to me, from emails we've received, that there were people in the State Department raising the alarm that this came not from a bat in China, but from a lab in China, and they were silenced. It seems to me that people in NIH had curiosity, and their curiosity was stopped. I want to find out who were the people involved in stopping asking the questions about could it have come from a lab, because those people did this country a great disservice. Early on, when this possibility was raised, it was shot down. It was shot down heavily. Anybody suggested it came out of the lab was a right-wing nut. Now that's not science, that's politics. Is there politics in science? It appears they may be. Is there a component in the scientific community that's trying to hide the relationship between the United States and the lab? Maybe, I don't know. But I do know this. The voices that raised concern about the lab leak were silenced. And we're going to have hearings, I hope, in the Senate to find out why those voices were silenced. Why did the scientific community come out so hard against a lab leak when they really didn't know? What was the motivation behind that? I think it's important for the American people to understand that and make sure that this never happens again here at home. Secondly, we've got to put pressure on China to make sure it's not a dog and pony show, it's a real investigation.
Your reaction to the emails from Fauci that have been released?
Well, I know Dr. Fauci. I want to find out what happened. In the email chain, people are raising the possibility of a lab leak. Not so much Dr. Fauci, but other scientists that were tied to the research, NIH, the relationship between NIH and the Wuhan lab, came out hard, saying that anybody who suggested this was a leak from a lab was pushing conspiracy theories, not good science. It now appears that they didn't have science to say that. So I think it's incumbent upon Dr. Fauci, who's in charge of all these grants, to come before the Congress and answer these questions. How could these scientists so early on shoot down the lab leak theory without a thorough investigation? And why were people who suggested it may have come out of the lab, why were they silenced? What were they trying to hide? And do you agree with the analysis in this Wall Street Journal editorial that seems to suggest the overwhelming evidence that the nature of this virus came from a lab, not from nature? Those are the things I want to know from Dr. Fauci. It's not about firing him for me, it's about finding out what happened and how it happened. And do we have a deep state science department that's protecting its turf? I think a couple things happened early on. There are people that did not want Trump to be right. Trump suggested this may have come from the lab, and he was called a xenophobic racist by suggesting it came from the lab in China. Well, some people just don't want Trump to ever be right, and those same people are stakeholders in the grant program, where their livelihood is on the line. So the people doing the investigation need to be outside of this system. We truly need independent people here in our country asking these questions and digging for the answers. I think it starts with Dr. Fauci coming before Congress and answering the questions I've just proposed.
You mentioned that there's been a shift in perception of this theory from being dismissed in the mainstream
Yes.
to being seen as more credible. What do you think it is that's driven that shift over time?
I think during the election, there was a real effort to blame everything on Trump and to marginalize his theory of the case. It seems to be, the Russian dossier is similar to me. You had all this information that the document collected by Christopher Steele was not reliable, but people used it anyway. They wanted an outcome. I think there's a storyline developing here that people wanted an outcome. They wanted to shoot down the idea it could be a lab leak because Trump would have been right. Maybe they were protecting their own self-interest here. So that's what I want to look at. Follow the money is a general rule in this kind of stuff. And I hate to say, but I think part of the motivations were political, not scientific. And we saw that in the FBI, where the system failed. The system ran every stop sign presented because they seemed to want an outcome. Did this happen here on the science side? Was the science not validated? Did they jump to a conclusion because they wanted a political outcome, not a scientific outcome? If it's true they used politics not science, then that really is unnerving to all of us.
Senator Graham,
Yeah.
doing another hearing at this point, like, what's the point of doing another hearing? Seems like we're doing hearings just to have hearings.
We really-
Nothing ever gets resolved
Yeah.
or
Good question.
finalized.
Well, I think we had hearings about the Carter Page warrant. A lot got resolved. The FISA court rebuked the FBI and Department of Justice for fraudulently obtaining a warrant. One guy went to jail. I think truth here is very important, and we haven't had an investigation. I would argue that there's been no investigation inside of China, as she indicated. It was a tour. I would argue nobody's looked hard here, that they set up a system in the State Department and was shot down. So here's my belief. After 500,000+ people dying, we still haven't really looked long and hard how this happened. And until we do that, we can't prevent it in the future. And if the system has a political bias, I want to know about it. This shouldn't be political. If it is political, that is very unnerving.